All right, so I'm going to be talking now about the feed services. We've been alluding to this throughout the day, during the Enhanced Campaigns session, during my opening session, during the reporting session. Now you actually get to find out what it's about. And I'll actually be talking about 4 different services today, which work in tandem to create a wide variety of ad extensions in v2013-02. And collectively, I'll refer to these as the feed services. So for those of you that are unfamiliar, this is what ad extensions look like today. We have site links at the top. We have product extension at the bottom. And ad extensions themselves are not changing, just the way that we create them. But why change what's already working, right? We've had ad extension support in the API for a couple of years. We support a wide variety of extensions. And they're not broken. Well, in a sense they are, because they're prohibiting us from launching new types of ad extensions. They're prohibiting us from launching changes to existing ad extensions as quickly as we would like to. Ad extensions, at least in my opinion, are one of the most exciting and creative aspects of AdWords today. They really take the conventional text ad and make it much more engaging, lead to much better conversions. And we really don't want to hold back from improving this framework just because the API isn't where it should be. So the most fundamental part of creating your ad extensions with feeds is a reusable table of data that describes the extensions that you'd like to create. Now, all of these services use the word feed, and that's basically, you can think of that as a synonym for table in this sense. And I'll actually use the two synonymously throughout my presentation, feed and table. It's just a two-dimensional grid of data. This table lives at the account level, meaning that you can use it for any of your campaigns within your account, and you can have up to 20 of these per account as well. So, in order to create these new ad extensions, there are 5 steps, 4 services. First step uses the feed service. It's the definition step, and it's where you actually create your table by setting the column names and setting the column data types. You can think of this, if you were writing SQL, this would be like the create table statement. Step 2 is to populate the table with data using the feed item service. This is like an insert statement in SQL. But that's kind of where the similarities to SQL end. In step 3, you'll be mapping the columns in the table you created in step 1 to the attributes of the ad extension object itself. So the table that you create in steps 1 and 2 is a generic table of data, although you give the columns types like URL or text. They're not specific to any type of ad extension. In step 3, you actually say, okay, now this column corresponds to a certain field of a certain ad extension. Step 4, we take this table and we associate it with a campaign. We say, okay, for this campaign, whenever it serves, check this table full of feed items and see if any of them are applicable and should serve as ad extensions along with this campaign. And the last step is validation. This is done in a little bit of a non-traditional way as far as the AdWords API goes, because you create the data in the first couple of steps, but then in steps 3 and 4, you describe how the data is going to be used. Therefore, we can't do validation on the data when you first create it. We kind of have to do it retrospectively. I will do that again using the feed item service, the same service we used in step 2. Okay, so let's walk through each of these in a little bit more detail. First step, defining our table. All right. Fundamentally, we're going to create a feed object. It has 2 properties. Its name, let's call it site links feed. In this example, we're going to create some site links. And it has an ID that you get back after you create it. Within our feed item, we're going to create multiple feed attributes, where each feed attribute corresponds to a column within your table. So the feed is the table itself. The feed attributes are the columns within the table. And each feed attribute has its type. That's its data type. Right? On the left side, we have a string. On the right side, we have a URL. And then we have the label for that particular column. On the left, the label is link text. On the right, the label is link URL. Okay, Now we're going to populate it with data. Using the feed item service, we're going to insert rows into this table, or feed items into this feed. Same thing. Each feed item has a feed ID that you get back after creating it. An array of attributes, where each item within the array corresponds to one of the columns in your feed. Okay. Now let's map the columns in our field from our feed from step 1 to the fields of a add extension object. So, as I mentioned, up until this point, we've been defining just a generic table of data. Even though I've been using sitelinks as an example and naming things sitelinks this or sitelinks that, it's just been a table of strings and URLs, and that's it. Now we're actually going to introduce real sitelinks into this process. So using the feed mapping service, we're going to create a new feed mapping object. And the feed mapping object is a relationship between a feed and a type of add extension. It's not a relationship between an individual add extension. It's the abstract concept, the class, if you will, of an add extension. We say that this feed mapping is going to be sitelinks related by giving it the placeholder type of placeholder sitelinks. And then within the feed mapping, we provide an array, a list of attribute field mappings, one for each column within our within our feed. We provide one attribute field mapping that contains an attribute ID and a field ID. The attribute ID corresponds to the columns within our feed, and the field ID refers to the actual property of an add extension. Okay, so step 4. At this point, the table's been defined. It's been filled with data, and the columns have been mapped to the attributes of your site links, right? All that's left, well, is to point it to one of your campaigns and then validate. Let's point it to our campaigns. So this is where it gets a little bit unusual by AdWords API standards. Our campaign feed object is used to create this association, and it has 2 very predictable fields. It has our feed ID, which is the ID we got back after creating the feed in step 1, and it has the campaign ID, which is pretty self-explanatory. What's this about a function object, right? Since when do we ask you guys to define subroutines within the AdWords API? And this isn't so much a subroutine as a simple comparison function. It's your selector. It's your select statement within your, that you're using to select from this table, if we're going back to the SQL analogy. And it's specifically, it's the where clause of your select statement. So the left-hand side operand is one thing that you're comparing. The right-hand side operand is the other thing that you're comparing against the left-hand side operand, and the operator is the operator for making the comparison. Right now, there are 2 options for operator. There's in and equals. And there's only one option for left-hand side operand, which is the feed item ID. So in step 2, remember we inserted a bunch of rows into our table. Each one is given an ID afterwards. We're going to say, when we create this function, give me all of the rows from this table, from this feed, where the left-hand side operator, the feed item ID, equals whatever integer value we stick in the right-hand side operand. All right, you guys with me on that? Okay, so last step is we're going to validate, right? Remember I talked about the fact that when we created all of our data originally, AdWords had no way at that time of knowing, okay, this particular URL that you just created, that's going to be used for a site link for this particular campaign with these settings serving in this country with these editorial guidelines, etc. That's why we have to do all of our validation after the fact. We do that with the feed item service, the same service that we use to create the rows in our table in step 2, except this time instead of a mutate call, it's a get call. Right? We're going to pull down all of the items within any given feed, and you can use selector to filter on them as well. We get back an array of feed items, And each item contains a feed item validation detail array. And each feed item validation detail has a validation status and an approval status. Validation status is what you can think of as a conventional real-time or semi-real-time computerized check for validity of your data. Approval status, however, is the asynchronous human-checked aspect. It's making sure that you're not making inaccurate claims within your text. It's making sure that your business name matches your website, and some of those things that we use humans to verify and we can't really do accurately enough with machines yet. So validation status should be available as soon as you've completed steps 1 through 4. Approval status can take sometimes up to a day or 2 even to have that checked by people. So my recommendation is treat this the same way that you treat ad approvals. After you create it, set some sort of timer or queue to go back and check with some sort of delay, make sure that everything's been approved.